I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years, starting in Central America during the war in El Salvador, Nicaragua, where I was for 5 years. Then I took a sabbatical, studied Arabic, was 7 years in the Middle East, and then went to the Balkans, where I covered the wars in Bosnia, Kosovo. It was coming back to the country and seeing the deterioration that had happened over the past 2 decades. It's a little starker when you've been away. And then I began to grapple when I returned with what had taken place within the United States.
When Obama took office, I was extremely excited about that. I actually worked a little bit on his campaign, gave money to politics for the first time in my life, had an Obama dance. I couldn't stop crying the night he was elected because I was so proud. And instead, he's actually perpetuated what the Bush administration started and taken it even further. I was so deeply disturbed by what was happening with the US government since 9/11 that I was compelled to start something to stop this.
I had written a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning that was a kind of meditation on war, the poison of war, what it does to individuals and societies. It came out in the fall of 2001 or 2002. Yeah, 2002. And at the time of the attempt to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Now, I'd spent a long time in the region and a lot of time in Iraq, and when I was questioned about the book on book tours and lectures, I would invariably be asked about the impending invasion of Iraq, which I denounced for all the reasons we now know. And in the spring of 2003, I gave a commencement address where I denounced the war. I was booed off of the stage. It's all on YouTube. My microphone was cut. At one point, the crowd got up and began singing "God Bless America." And then this trash talk cable news shows got a hold of sort of home movie footage, looped it, lynched me, which is what they do hour after hour over a few days, pressed the New York Times for a response. The New York Times gave me a formal written reprimand, which is because we're Guild. The process is you give the employee the written reprimand, and then when they violate that reprimand again, you have grounds to fire them. And so I realized that I was faced with a choice. I could muzzle myself in service of my career, or I could continue to speak a truth, an uncomfortable truth. And I chose to speak that truth, and I left the newspaper.
What actually really sparked what I'm doing now is Attorney General Eric Holder in November of 2011, or maybe it was October 2011, signaling a willingness to significantly harm First Amendment rights over the Obama administration's zealous fight to bring down WikiLeaks.
I had known Tangerine. I had covered her as a journalist. And I remember posting something personally on my private Facebook profile about the passage of the bill, and I essentially likened it to the end of the Roman Republic. I mean, we could no longer call ourselves a democratic republic with this passage.
And so here we are engaged in this surreal war on terror, and we've gone so far down this wrong road. And I'm not saying that terrorism is not an issue, it is. But there's the legitimate part of that issue, and then there's this whole overblown craziness.
As the case became, started to organize, she just approached me and said, you know, you should talk to Mr. Mayer, Carl Mayer, who's one of the lawyers, the counsel on this particular case.
The NDAA is a bill that's passed into law every single year. It's the Military Budget Appropriations Act. It's how we fund our military. That's fine, all well and good up to that point. This year, there were provisions within the NDAA that were entirely different than in our past. And why? My instinct is one thing, and it basically tells me that the US government seems a little bit afraid right now.
Internally, analysts realize the obvious, which is the breakdown of globalization. They grasp that the economic situation will deteriorate. Certainly this young generation of Americans are never going to achieve the economic level of their parents or their grandparents.
Occupy Wall Street sparked a global movement on the heels of Arab Spring There are uprisings happening all around the world. People are very agitated and understandably very angry in this country.
And they're preparing for civil unrest. They're preparing themselves to create a state by which citizens can be subjugated, and they've actually gone very far down that road.
I think there are a lot of things that have gotten the US government on edge. It's digging its heels in deeper and deeper and deeper, and then passing legislation that is exceedingly disturbing.
The Authorization to Use Military Force Act, the Patriot Act, the FISA Amendment Act, it's just sort of one piece of legislation after another to strip Americans of their most cherished constitutional rights. I mean, even the Obama administration has not found it within itself to restore habeas corpus. All of this was put in place by Bush, but it was codified by the Democrats. In some ways, Obama's worse because he's used the Espionage Act now 6 times to go after whistleblowers and leakers.
Obama is a constitutional law scholar. He knows better. But what he's doing is he's using the language of the law to try to say that unconstitutional things are actually allowable. For example, assassinating US citizens, denying due process, suspending habeas corpus.
Well, the National Defense Authorization Act overturns over 200 years of legal precedent, which permits the military to carry out civilian policing. It permits the government to hold US citizens who either substantially support terrorist networks or associated forces, whatever those are, in military facilities, strip them of due process, and even hold them overseas in one of our black sites until, in the language of the legislation, the end of hostilities. It is absolutely catastrophic and is part of this slow process by which we are shorn of any legal protection to carry out, any kind of free speech or dissident activity.
Chris Hedges initiated this lawsuit, and I approached him and asked him to amend it, so we amended it. I became a plaintiff. Kai Wargalla, she's one of the co-founders of Occupy London, which has been named a terrorist group by the London Police Department. She's a plaintiff.
I co-founded the Facebook and the Twitter account that sparked Occupy London, and I started to organize it by the end of September 2011. We were I would say about 10 core people who were organizing this and who made it happen. And then on October 15th, of course, thousands of people showed up and pitched their tents and just stayed there. The terrorism update from the City of London Police Department, that was in December. You should have seen our faces. We were like, what the fuck? I mean, there's a list, a terrorism update, which lists Al-Qaeda, the FARC, and Occupy London. The first reaction actually was, this must be a joke. This cannot be real. So we took pictures of it, we asked around, we trying to ask the police if that is real, and in the end, yes, it was real. And we were absolutely shocked because we had no idea how this happened.
Alexa O'Brien in New York City, who founded US Day of Rage, which is just a group to reform electoral politics. She's a plaintiff.
What ended up happening was in August of 2011, we went viral in the Arab world. I mean, we went viral. I mean, the Egyptians were like, oh my God, there's, when we endorsed the call to Occupy Wall Street. And so we had people sending us how to protest nonviolent letters. I mean, Egyptians were just over the hill, and we also went viral in Bahrain. But at some point on August 18th, private security contractors were talking with Stratford, according to this report. I mean, I have the email saying, we've been asked specifically to tie US Day of Rage to Islamic fundamentalists. And then after September 17th, Thomas Ryan, who's one of the managing directors for this Provide Security, posts an article saying that, US Day of Rage is associated with terrorists, and and that he's sent that information to the FBI field office in New York.
Noam Chomsky, Professor Noam Chomsky, our illustrious hero, is a plaintiff. Daniel Elsberg from the Pentagon Papers, one of the greatest whistleblowers in the history of this country. And Birgitta Jónsdóttir, she's an Icelandic parliamentarian who has spearheaded the world's strongest freedom of information laws for Iceland, and she's a plaintiff as well.
My tactic is civil disobedience. I think that there is no way in America to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. The political system is rigged. It doesn't really matter whether it's Obama or Bush. And all we have are acts of civil disobedience. So I will use every method available to me to try and obstruct what the corporate state is doing. So when they passed the NDAA, I did not want to let it go unchallenged. I have a pretty realistic view of the court system, and in particular the Supreme Court. If this challenge ever reached the Supreme Court, the likelihood that the configuration of this court will rule in my favor is extremely small. But that doesn't matter. I mean, I come out of seminary, and you have a kind of moral obligation to resist in every way possible, and that's certainly why I began this lawsuit.
The corruption of the U.S. system of checks and balances runs much deeper than the NDAA. I mean, obviously it's the application of executive power, but it's basically the military is managed, the justice system, et cetera, is managed by the Congress. We need to completely have a revolution in the Congress. And the only way we can do that is by reforming our corrupt elections.
I mean, we've undergone a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion. We have 35,000 corporate lobbyists who write every piece of legislation, every regulation, every law. And it's a narrow, corrupt, rapacious, oligarchic corporate elite that are harvesting the country. It's a business term where they recognize that it's over. They're just trying to grab as much as they can. And the elected officials and the political class are just corporate employees.
It's a huge uphill battle for all of us because the mainstream media either exhibits complete disinterest or actually even almost seems like a blockade against real news.
The reason you don't read it in the news is because the partisan cable channels, and I would pull out MSNBC and Fox, split down party lines. So you have Fox as a cheerleader for the Republican Party, and you have MSNBC and Al Sharpton and Rachel Maddow and all these people cheerleading for the Democratic Party. Well, this bill has bipartisan support. In fact, it was sponsored by Carl Levin, a Democrat, and John McCain, a Republican. And everything is acceptable for discussion over the airwaves as long as it's within the narrow parameters of A to B. And once you get to C and D, you become a pariah. All of the issues that really count to Americans no longer make it on the airwaves. They're not talked about.
The one upside of that bizarre situation, though, is that citizen-driven media is on the rise. And in fact, our group that we run is an international alternative media platform. And there are bloggers, live streamers across the country who rose up out of Occupy. So, you know what? The people will fill the gap. When the mainstream media is utterly failing to do its job as it is, somehow there will eventually be a course correction. Are we there yet? No.
It doesn't matter what citizens want. Nobody supported the looting of the U.S. Treasury and the largest transference of wealth upwards, across the political spectrum. No serious effort to address the foreclosures and mortgage crisis. It's pretty staggering. And what's dangerous is that this narrow elite has just disconnected from the rest of the country and live within their gated compounds, like the old mandarins in the Forbidden City or Versailles. And the more they lose touch, the more dangerous it becomes because they have no way of gauging when they've pushed too far. And I think the closure of the 18 Occupy encampments, the attempt to physically eradicate these encampments, and the apparently massive efforts at internal surveillance and disruption shows that the only language these people now are going to speak is the language of force and control and violence. And that's really dangerous because all of the injustices and grievances that drove people into those camps are not only there but getting worse, and they refuse to address them. And so, as George Orwell said, totalitarian societies rule through force, or fraud and force, and the fraud's being exposed, and force is pretty much all we have left. And as a war correspondent, my job was to defy authority, and often defy authority that threatened to kill me. So the very characteristics that made me a good war correspondent make me a very good dissident, because it's, just in essence, it's really hard to make me afraid.